Three sisters asked an American man to father their children, while the whole village watched. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not an absence of sound. The air hummed with the chitinous thrum of a million unseen insects, and the distant, throaty caw of a jungle bird echoed off the limestone karsts, but a silence of expectation. The entire village, 100 souls or more, stood in a wide, muddy semicircle, their faces upturned towards the stilted longhouse. They were watching him, their eyes, dark and polished as river stones, held no judgment, no malice, just a profound, unnerving stillness. It felt less like a welcome and more like a weighing. Ethan stood on the longhouse veranda, the damp, cool wood pressing against the soles of his bare feet. The air was thick, a wet blanket of frangipani, wood smoke, and something else, something metallic and vaguely unsettling, like the smell of blood after a storm. Beside him, the village elder, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles, cleared his throat. The sound was like dry leaves skittering across stone. Then they came. 3 women, walking single file from the heart of the crowd. They moved with a liquid grace that belied the sucking mud around their ankles. The first, her hair pulled back, in a severe glossy knot, had a face of stern classical beauty, her high cheekbones catching the bruised purple light of the impending twilight. The second was softer, her eyes wide and luminous, a shy smile playing on her lips as if she were sharing a secret with the air itself. The third, the youngest, was fire. Her gaze was direct, challenging, a flicker of defiance in the way she held her chin. They wore identical hand-woven skirts of indigo and crimson, but on each the fabric seemed to tell a different story. They stopped at the foot of the veranda stairs, their heads bowed, not in subservience, but in ceremony. The elder spoke, his voice a low, gravelly chant in a language Ethan didn't understand. The words washed over him, meaningless phonemes that carried the weight of ritual. Ethan's translator, a nervous young man from the nearest town named Bo, whispered at his elbow, his voice trembling. He says they are the daughters of the mountain, Lean the rock, Mai, the river, Ho, the fire. Ethan nodded. His throat suddenly tight, felt a bead of sweat trace a path down his spine, cold and slow. The elder finished his chant and gestured to the 3 women. They ascended the stairs, their bare feet silent on the wood. They knelt before him, a tableau of impossible grace and gravity. The scent of them clean sweat, crushed herbs, and the faint, sweet smell of coconut oil in their hair enveloped him. Lean, the eldest, looked up, her gaze unflinching. She spoke, her voice clear and steady, and Bao, after a moment's hesitation, translated. Mr. Ethan Bao whispered, his eyes fixed on the floorboards. She says they honor you. They've watched you since you arrived. They see the goodness in your spirit. Ethan's mind flashed, unbidden, to the reason he was here, a world away from the sterile white corridors of his Boston clinic. It wasn't goodness that had driven him here, but failure. A profound cellular failure that had hollowed him out from the inside. The second sister lifted her head. Her eyes were full of a deep liquid sorrow that seemed to mirror his own. She spoke softly, her words a murmur. She says they see your sadness, Bo stammered, his discomfort palpable, man who is empty. A field that has not been planted. Ethan's jaw clenched. How could they know? How could they see the ghost of his ex-wife, Catherine, her face pale with pity as she'd handed him the final, damning lab report? The word azoospermia had become the defining feature of his existence. No sperm. A biological dead end. A field that could never be planted. Finally, Ho, the youngest, looked up. Her eyes weren't sad or respectful. They were hungry. They roamed over his face, his shoulders, his hands, as if she were memorizing him, or perhaps consuming him. She says a field can be made fertile again, Bo whispered, his voice cracking. The soil can be woken. The elder stepped forward, his bare feet making a soft slapping sound on the wood. He placed a hand on each sister's shoulder. Mr. Ethan Bao said, his voice barely audible now. They ask you to stay. They ask you to live with them. They ask you to be the father of their children. The words hung in the thick, humid air. The hum of the insects seemed to crescendo into a roar. The 100 pairs of eyes below remained fixed on him, silent, waiting. 3 sisters. 3 beautiful, vibrant women kneeling before him, asking for the one thing in the universe he could not give. The irony was a physical blow, a vicious cosmic punchline that left him breathless. He felt a hysterical laugh bubble in his chest, a sound of pure madness. He was a fraud, a broken specimen who had run to the edge of the world to escape his own uselessness, only to have it served up to him as a sacred request. He looked from Lean's stoic determination to Mai's soulful plea, to Ho's raw ambition. He looked at the sea of expectant faces below. There was no escape. He was trapped on this veranda in this moment, suspended between an impossible request and an unspeakable truth, the question that echoed in the sudden ringing silence. Of his mind was not why they were asking, but a far more terrifying one. What would happen to him when he told them no? The laughter died in his throat, replaced by a cold dread. He had come here seeking oblivion, a place so remote he could forget the man he was supposed to be. But in their request, they weren't just asking for a father. They were offering him a ghost of a life he thought was buried forever. A life of purpose, of legacy. A life built on a lie he couldn't confess and a promise he couldn't possibly fulfill. He was a doctor, a man of science and hard truths. His whole life had been a quest for answers, for diagnoses, for certainty. He had fled the wreckage of his marriage, the pity in his colleagues' eyes, the suffocating quiet of his empty home. Catherine had wanted a family with a desperate, all-consuming passion, desire. Her desire was a physical presence in their marriage, a third person in their bed. He had submitted to every test, every humiliating procedure, clinging to the hope that the problem wasn't him, but it was always him. Fault, the failure, the genetic dead end. He remembered the finality in her voice, not angry, just, "I can't do this, Ethan. I can't live in a house of ghosts." He hadn't understood then, but he did now. He'd become the ghost. He'd sold his practice, liquidated his assets, and bought a one-way ticket to Hanoi from there. He just drifted, pushing further and further inland, away from tourists and expats, seeking a place where the name Dr. Ethan Hayes meant nothing. He'd found it in Ban Skung Mu, the village of fog, a place so isolated it wasn't on any modern map. He'd been trading his medical skills for food and shelter, treating infected cuts, setting broken bones, and delivering the occasional baby, a task that always left him feeling hollowed out and raw. He was a healer who couldn't heal himself, a deliverer of life who was fundamentally lifeless. He was respected here, useful, but it was a performance. Every time he held a newborn, its tiny fingers curling around his, he felt the lie chilling his skin. Now, this public ritualized request. It was grotesque. He felt a surge of anger at the elder, at Bao for his trembling translation, at the sisters for their impossible hope. He opened his mouth to say no, to explain, to lay his shame bare and watch the reverence in their eyes curdle into the same pity he'd seen in Catherine's. But the word wouldn't come. He looked at the gentle river of her gaze, and saw not just a request, but a deep, aching need that resonated with his own. He looked at Lean the Rock, and saw a woman willing to sacrifice her pride for the survival of her family. Looked at Ho, the fire, and saw a desperate yearning for a different future. They weren't asking for his sperm, they were asking for his hope. He had none to give. I cannot, he managed, the words scraping his throat. Bao translated, his voice low. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not of anger, but of confusion. The elder's expression didn't change. Lean spoke again, her tone even practical. Tell him we understand. He is a man from a different world. He needs time. We will give him time. He will stay in our family's longhouse. We will care for him. He will see our ways. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement of fact. Before he could protest, the sisters rose. Lane took his left hand. Ho is right. Their grip was surprisingly strong. Mai placed a gentle hand on his back. They led him down the steps and through the silent parting crowd. The villagers' eyes followed him, no longer just watching, but possessing. Felt like a prize bull. Being led to a new pasture, the metallic scent in the air was stronger now, and he finally placed it. The smell of sacrificial blood, dried on the ceremonial posts that flanked the longhouse entrance. Their family longhouse was at the far edge of the village, perched on a slope overlooking a valley of terraced rice paddies that descended like green stairways into the mist. It was a beautiful, haunting prison. The inside was one long, open room divided by woven mats and embroidered hangings. It smelled of dried thatch, chili, and old wood. An ancient, wrinkled woman, their grandmother, sat by the central fire pit, her eyes cloudy with cataracts but missing nothing. She nodded at him as he entered, a gesture of ancient welcome. The days that followed blurred into a strange, seductive rhythm. The culture shock was a constant low-grade fever. There was no privacy. He ate, slept, and lived in the constant, quiet presence of the three sisters and their grandmother. They communicated through a tapestry of gestures, smiles, and the few words Bo had taught him. See him in. Thank you, Shinchal. Hello, Ingon. Delicious. He learned them through their actions. Lean was the first to rise each morning, her movements. Efficient and precise as she stoked the fire and prepared the morning rice soup, she managed the family's small plot of land, her hands calloused, her back strong. She rarely smiled, but when she did, it was like sunlight breaking through stone, rare and startlingly beautiful. She would watch him sometimes as he read one of the tattered paperbacks he'd brought with him, her expression one of intense calculation, as if she were trying to solve the puzzle of him. Mai was the artist. She spent her days at a loom, her slender fingers flying as she wove intricate patterns of spirits and ancestors into deep indigo cloth. She was the one who would bring him tea, her movements hesitant, her eyes always cast down until the moment she looked up, and in that glance he felt a jolt of connection, a shared understanding of a sorrow that needed no words. She was the one who tried to teach him their language, her laughter soft and encouraging when he mangled the tones. He found himself listening for the sound of her loom, the steady, rhythmic thump-clack, a comfort in the disorienting strangeness of his new life. Hoa was a whirlwind. She refused the traditional roles. She would disappear for hours, returning with wild orchids from the deep forest or a fish speared from the river. She was fearless and endlessly curious about him. She would pick up his things as worn leather, journal, his solar-powered radio, his multi-tool, and examine them with an intensity that was both unnerving and flattering. She would ask him questions through gestures, pointing to the sky, then to his watch, trying to understand his conception of time. Her English was a clumsy, enthusiastic collection of words gleaned from the radio. "Ing sky big," she'd say. "Grinning you. Fly." Her energy was exhausting and exhilarating. He was being seduced not by overt actions, but by a slow, creeping intimacy. They cared for him with a quiet, profound diligence. They mended his torn shirt. They cooked him foods he'd never tasted, strange, wonderful concoctions of bamboo shoots, river snails, and fiery peppers. They learned his habits, knowing when he wanted solitude and when his loneliness became too heavy. They made him a part of their small, female world, and in this world, his shame began to feel distant. The crisp, clinical finality of the Boston lab felt like a dream from another life. Here, life was not about clinical data. It was about the soil, the rain, the seasons, the spirits. Fertility was not a number on a chart. It was a blessing from the mountain, a prayer whispered into the wind. It was Dr. Ethan Hayes, the sterile man. But here, in the village of Fog, he was just Ethan. A man who was strong, who could fix a dislocated shoulder, who knew how to purify water. A man who was seen not for what he lacked, but for what he possessed. The moral dilemma began to sharpen its claws. His Western ethics screamed that this was wrong. It was a transaction. It was a genetic commodity. They didn't know him, not the real him, the failure. But his heart, a long-dormant organ, was starting to beat again. He felt a sense of belonging he hadn't felt since childhood. It was woven into the fabric of their lives, and the thought of tearing himself away was becoming physically painful. One evening, a monsoon storm rolled in, trapping them in the longhouse. The rain hammered on the thatched roof, a deafening, relentless roar. The world outside dissolved into a gray sheet of water. The grandmother was asleep, her breathing a soft, rattling whisper. The fire cast flickering shadows that danced on. The walls like ancient spirits. Lean was sharpening a knife, the rhythmic shing shing shing, a counterpoint to the storm. Mai was weaving, her face serene in the firelight. Ho was restlessly pacing, a caged animal. She stopped in front of him. "You sad?" she said. Not a question, but a statement. She pointed to his chest. "Here." He just nodded, the weight of his past suddenly crushing him. She sat down beside him, closer than she ever had before. She reached out and with a startling boldness placed her hand on his knee. Her touch was warm, her palm calloused but gentle. He didn't pull away. "Why, she asked. He looked at her, then at her sisters. Lean had stopped sharpening the knife, her hand still. Mai's loom was silent. They were all watching him, waiting. He knew he should tell them, he should use the one word they would all understand: no. He should explain the science, the biology, the cold hard fact of his condition. It would be the honorable thing to do, the right thing. But as he looked at Ho's fierce, hopeful face, he felt a powerful, irresistible temptation. The temptation to lie, the temptation to say yes, to try, to let them believe, and in doing so, to let himself believe, just for a little while. What if science was wrong? What if this place, this faith, this magic could actually change him? It was an insane, irrational thought, a betrayal of everything he was. And he wanted it, more than he had ever wanted anything. This was the moment, the wrong but tempting moment. To choose the comforting lie over the devastating truth, he didn't answer her question. Instead, he met her gaze, and for the first time, he didn't look away. He let her see the chink in his armor, the flicker of a desire he thought had died long ago. Mai, seeing the exchange, put down her shuttle. She rose and came to sit on his other side. But he could feel the warmth radiating from her. She began to hum, a low, ancient lullaby that vibrated in the air. A melody that spoke of harvests and hearths, of children sleeping safely through a storm. Lean watched them both, her expression unreadable. Then she put down her knife and came to sit across from them, completing the circle. She simply held his gaze, and in her eyes, he saw not a demand, but an invitation. An invitation to a world governed by different rules. A world where a man's worth wasn't measured by what his body could produce, but by the role he was willing to play. The storm raged outside. But inside the longhouse, a different kind of storm was brewing in Ethan's soul. He was caught between three sisters, between two worlds. Between a lie that felt like salvation and a truth that felt like a curse. The line between right and wrong had not just blurred. It had dissolved into the fog, felt them drawing him. In their shared silent will, a force more powerful than the monsoon. And the most terrifying part was that he was no longer fighting it. He was letting himself drown. The weeks that followed were a descent into a dream, his old life, his identity. As a failed Boston doctor, receded like a shoreline viewed from a departing ship, the village of Banskung-Mu became his reality. He learned the rhythm of the rains, the phases of the moon, the names of the edible plants in the forest. He worked alongside Lean in the paddies, the thick, wet mud sucking at his calves, the sun beating down on his back. He felt a primal satisfaction in the ache of his muscles, the feeling of sweat and earth on his skin. With her, he felt grounded, solid. They spoke little, but their shared labor was a language of its own. He saw the respect in her eyes grow, a respect earned not by his past credentials, but by his present effort. With Mai, he discovered a different kind of intimacy. In the quiet afternoons, she would teach him the art of her loom. He'd sit beside her, his clumsy fingers fumbling with the threads as she guided him, her touch light and patient. She taught him the stories woven into the cloth, the great serpent that lived in the river, the sky goddess who wept the rain. Found himself confessing things to her in his own language, things he'd never told another soul about his childhood, his parents, his dreams before they'd soured. He knew she didn't understand the words, but she understood the melody of his grief. She would listen, her head tilted, her gaze full of an empathy that transcended language. With her, he felt seen, understood. Ho was his connection to a world of sensation. She would drag him on expeditions into the jungle, her laughter echoing through the canopy as he struggled to keep up. She taught him how to read the tracks of a wild pig, how to find the sweetest mangoes, how to swim in the cool, clear pools beneath waterfalls. She was relentlessly physical, her touches casual and frequent, a hand on his arm to steady him, a playful shove, her body brushing against his as they navigated a narrow path. With her, he felt alive, his senses heightened, his body reawakened. He was living in a state of suspended reality, a polygamous courtship that was both deeply taboo and strangely natural. He was falling not for one sister, but for the composite being they formed. Lean's strength, my soul, Ho's fire. The arrangement, which would have been a scandal in his world, was here a matter of honor and survival, was their shared hope, their collective future. The weight of it should have crushed him, but instead it gave him a sense of purpose he'd never known. The village watched, their silent approval a constant pressure, a warm embrace that felt more and more like a cage. The ethical lines were gone. Was this exploitation? Was it a form of love so foreign to his own culture that he couldn't recognize it? He was receiving as much as he was being asked to give, a home, a family, a reason to exist. The lie of his sterility remained a hard, cold stone in his gut, but he walled it off, burying it deeper with each passing day. He would cross that bridge when he came to it. He would let himself have this impossible dreamlike existence. One night, the moon was full, a perfect silver disk that bathed the valley in an ethereal glow. The village held a festival. Rice wine, potent and sweet, flowed freely. Music, played on bamboo flutes and buffalo-hide drums, pulsed through the night. Ethan, flushed with wine and the heat from the central bonfire, felt a giddy sense of belonging. Hoa, her face gleaming with sweat, her eyes bright with wine and mischief, pulled him into the dance. The dance was a wild, stamping, whirling affair, a story of hunt and harvest, of life and death. He was clumsy, but he laughed, letting the rhythm take him. He caught Lean's eye across the fire. She was watching, a rare, genuine smile on her face. He saw Mai clapping along to the music, her gentle face full of joy. In that moment, he felt a surge of overwhelming affection for them, for this entire village, for this life that had claimed him. Later, as the bonfire burned down 2 glowing embers, Ho led him away from the dying celebration. She pulled him toward the edge of the forest, her hand tight in his. "Come," she whispered, her voice husky. She led him to a small clearing, where a flat, moss-covered rock overlooked the moonlit valley. The world was silver in shadow. Air was cool and smelled of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. "Here," she said, stopping and turning to face him. "Is good." She stepped closer, her body almost touching his. She looked up at him, her youthful face suddenly serious, her bravado gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You have good face," she said softly. "Sad face, but good." This was it, the precipice. Could feel the unspoken question in her touch, see the invitation in her eyes. It was a moment of pure illicit temptation. To be with her here, under the moon, would be to betray. What an ethic from a world that no longer felt real. Promised to the other sisters who were, in their own way, part of this same silent contract. It was wrong. It was selfish. It was a violation of the fragile, complex balance he was living in, and he wanted it. The wine, the music, the raw, magnetic pull of her youth and vitality was an intoxicating cocktail. His body, long dormant, was screaming at him. What is it? So, also I did. To be a man, not a patient, not a failure, he leaned in, his mind shutting down, his senses taking over. He could smell the wine on her breath, see the moonlight reflected in the dark pools of her eyes. His hand came up to cup the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her thick dark hair. Then he stopped. A sound. The soft crack of a twig from the shadows just beyond the clearing. He froze, his heart pounding. Ho's eyes widened. They were not alone. Slowly Lean and Mai stepped out of the trees. They were not angry, their faces illuminated by the moonlight. Were calm, expectant. They had followed. They had watched. Ethan felt a wave of shame so intense it was nauseating. He had been about to cheapen their profound, strange offer, to reduce it to a sordid, drunken fumble in the woods with the most impulsive of the three. He had almost proven himself to be exactly the kind of selfish outsider they should have feared. He dropped his hand from Ho's neck and stepped back, the spell broken. Ho looked down, her face burning with the shame of her own. Leanne stepped forward. She looked not at Ethan, but at her younger sister. She spoke in their tongue, her voice not scolding, but firm and low. Ho nodded, not meeting her eyes. Mai went to Ho's side and put a comforting arm around her shoulders, leading her back toward the village. Now he was alone with Leanne. The silence stretched, thick with what had almost happened. "I'm sorry," he said, the English words feeling. Clumsy and inadequate? Leanne just looked at him, her gaze piercing. She stepped closer, stopping where Ho had stood. She studied his face in the moonlight, her expression one of cool assessment. Then she did something that shocked him more than Ho's seduction. She reached out and took his hand, turning it, over-examining his palm, the calluses he'd earned in her fields. She looked up at him. She spoke one word, a word he had learned. Gitchi. It meant okay, or yes, or it is time. Then she nodded her head, once. A gesture of finality. She turned and walked back toward the village, her back straight, her silhouette merging with the shadows. Ethan stood alone in the clearing, his body trembling with adrenaline and shame. He hadn't made a choice, but a choice had been made for him. The game was over. Seduction, the courtship, the slow, intoxicating dance, it was all finished. What came next would be the ceremony. The consummation of the contract he had never formally accepted but had been living for months. He understood now. It was never about him choosing one of them. It was about all of them choosing him. It was about him proving he was worthy of that choice. Tonight, he had almost failed the test. He looked out at the valley, a prison of breathtaking beauty. The lie in his gut felt like a coiled snake, ready to strike. He had to go through with it. He had to stand before the village, perform his sacred duty, and pray for a miracle he had no right to expect. And the most chilling thought of all was that if a miracle did happen, if by some impossible twist of fate he was not sterile, his lie would be exposed. He would be a father, but also a deceiver. He was caught in a trap of his own making, and the only way out was to go deeper in. The day of the ceremony arrived not with thunder, but with a quiet, pearlescent dawn. The fog clung to the valley floor, making the village feel like an island in a gray sea. A strange quiet had fallen. The usual morning sounds, the crowing of roosters, the pounding of rice were absent. It was a sacred day. Ethan hadn't slept. He had lain on his mat in the longhouse, listening to the soft breathing of the three sisters, a sound that had become his comfort and now felt like the ticking of a clock. He was a man walking to his own execution, or perhaps his coronation. Couldn't tell the difference. 2 of the village elders came for him at sunrise. They didn't speak, but led him to the river. The water was shockingly cold, and they made him strip and bathe, scrubbing his skin with rough bundles of fragrant leaves until he tingled. It was a purification, a stripping away of his old self. Dressed in a new, indigo-dyed shirt and trousers they provided, he felt like a stranger in his own body. They led him not to the main longhouse where the request had first been made, but to a smaller, older structure at the very edge of the village, one he'd never been allowed to enter. It was windowless, its thatch dark with age. The carved posts at the entrance depicted figures with exaggerated fertile bodies intertwined. With serpents and flowers, the air around it was thick with the scent of burning incense and something else, something ancient and loamy, like the smell of a freshly opened cave. Inside, the trembling glow. The elder, the one whose face was a map of time, sat in the center of the room on a low stool. Behind him stood Lean, Mai, and Ho. They were dressed not in their everyday clothes, but in magnificent ceremonial robes of scarlet and gold thread, their hair intricately braided with flowers. They looked like goddesses, beautiful and remote. The floor was covered with fresh banana leaves. In the center of the room, on a pile of soft, woven blankets, was a space. A bed. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. This was far more intimate, more terrifying than he had imagined. There were no watching crowds. The village was outside waiting, but the act itself was to be witnessed only by the elder, a spiritual chaperone to a moment of profound creation. The elder began to chant, his voice a low drone that seemed to make the very air vibrate. He spoke of the mountain spirit, of the river soul, of the seed in the soil, of the line of ancestors stretching back into the mist of time. He spoke of scarcity and survival, of a bloodline that had grown thin, of the need for new water in an old stream. As he chanted, Lean stepped forward. She carried a small lacquered bowl. She knelt before Ethan and offered it to him. It was rice wine, but it was different from the festival wine. It was thick, milky, and smelled of herbs he couldn't name. He knew he was supposed to drink it. His scientific mind screamed at him what was in it. A drug? An aphrodisiac? A poison? He looked into Leon's eyes. Her expression was serene, her hand steady. This was an act of faith. He took the bowl and drank. The liquid was fiery and sweet, spreading a strange warmth through his veins, dulling the sharp edges of his fear. Then it was Mai's turn. She came forward with a string of small white flowers. She placed the garland around his neck. The blossoms were cool against his skin, their scent dizzyingly sweet. Her fingers brushed against his neck, a touch as light as a butterfly's wing, yet it sent a shiver through him. He saw in her eyes a flicker of fear and a deep, trusting hope. She believed in this. She believed in him. The weight of her belief was crushing. Finally, she held not a bowl or flowers, but a single perfect lotus blossom, its petals just beginning to unfurl. She didn't offer it to him. Instead, she knelt and placed it on the ceremonial bed of blankets, a symbol of purity, of creation. Her earlier boldness was gone, replaced by a solemnity that was more stirring than any seduction. The elders' chant softened, then stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. He gestured with one gnarled hand toward the bed. Then he turned his back, a symbolic granting of privacy. Lean, Mai, and Ho now stood together, their hands clasped. They looked at him, their 3 faces a triptych of longing, duty, and hope. It was not a lustful gaze. It was something far deeper, more elemental. They weren't seeing Ethan Hayes, the failed doctor from Boston. They were seeing a vessel, a conduit for the future of their people. He knew what he was supposed to do. Walk to the bed, lie down, and wait. This was the climax, the unforgivable decision. His mind raced. He could still say no. He could confess his lie, could expose his worthless body, his broken biology. It would be the truth. It would save them from false hope, It would be his redemption, a final, painful act of honesty. But he looked at their faces. He saw the years of quiet desperation, the crushing weight of their village's survival resting on their slender shoulders. To tell them the truth now would not be an act of honor. It would be an act of unimaginable cruelty. It would be to extinguish the last light in a world of encroaching darkness. And what of himself? If he refused, he would be cast out. He would return to a world where he was nothing, a ghost in a house of ghosts. Here, even as a lie, he was a god. In that moment, something inside him broke. The man of science, the man of ethics, the man who believed in hard truths, he died. And a new man was born, one who would choose the beautiful, vital lie over the sterile, dead truth. He would choose comfort over honesty. He would choose their salvation over his own soul. It was an unforgivable decision, a damning of his own integrity, and it felt, in that moment, utterly and emotionally justified. He felt the warmth of the wine spreading through him, a pleasant, buzzing numbness. He walked toward the bed, his movements feeling slow, dreamlike. He saw the single lotus blossom, its petals a pristine white against the dark blankets. He lay down. He did not know who would come to him. Lean, the rock, Mai, the river, Ho, the fire, or all of them. The rules of this ritual were unknown to him. He closed his eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the scent of flowers and incense, to the heat of the lamps, to the profound, terrifying silence. He felt a presence beside him, a warmth. He smelled the scent of coconut oil and clean sweat. A hand, gentle and hesitant, touched his chest. He opened his eyes. It was Mai, the river. Her eyes were wide, luminous pools in the lamplight, reflecting a universe of hope and fear. Over him, her long hair brushing against his skin, and in that instant, he felt a surge of something so powerful it obliterated everything else. Not just lust, but a ferocious, protective tenderness. He would not fail her. He could not. He reached up and touched her face, his thumb stroking her cheek, and he prayed. Not to a god he no longer believed in, but to the mountain spirit, to the river soul, to the ancient, unknowable forces that governed this forgotten corner of the world. He prayed for a lie to become true. The days following the ceremony were a strange, liminal space. The village treated him with a new kind of reverence, a hushed respect that was both gratifying and deeply isolating. He was no longer just the foreign doctor. He was a sacred instrument, a man who had participated in the deepest ritual of their survival. He continued his life with the sisters, but the dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The easy intimacy was replaced by a quiet, anxious waiting. Every morning he would see them look at him, then at each other, their silent glances full of questions. He couldn't answer. We had slept with Mai that night, an act of such profound, prayerful intensity it had felt less like sex and more like the planting of a desperate seed in barren ground. Lin and Ho had kept their distance, their roles in the contract fulfilled by their presence, their symbolic offerings. The choice of Mai had been, he sensed, the correct one. The heart of the family, he threw himself into the work of the village, needing the physical exhaustion to quiet the screaming in his own mind. He helped build a new sluice for the rice paddies, his hands blistering and bleeding, but he welcomed. The pain, it was real, it was honest. Unlike him, the lie was a constant companion, a cold dread in the pit of his stomach. He would wake in the night, sweating, the word azoospermia echoing in his memory. He was a time bomb, a fraud waiting to be exposed by the simple, relentless passage of time. 2 months passed. The rains lessened, and the harvest season approached. The anxiety in the longhouse was a palpable thing, a fifth presence at the fire pit. Mai grew quieter, more withdrawn. He saw some mornings retching behind the longhouse, and his heart would seize with a terrifying, exhilarating hope. Could it be? Could a miracle have happened? Or was it just a sickness from the water? Then, one evening, the grandmother, the ancient silent matriarch, beckoned him over. The sisters were there, sitting in a line. The old woman looked at Mai, then at Ethan. She smiled. a crack in the ancient mask of her face, revealing gums as smooth as polished stone. She patted Mai's belly, then made a rocking motion with her arms. Lean spoke, her voice tight with emotion. She used the few English words Mai had taught him, reinforcing them with gestures. My baby. The word hit him like a physical blow, baby. He stared at Mai. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears, and she gave a small, hesitant nod. A smile of pure, unadulterated joy broke across her face. Ho let out a whoop of delight, rushing to hug her sister. Lean's stoic facade crumbled, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs of relief. Ethan felt nothing. Just a profound, vertiginous shock. It was impossible. Science said it was impossible. His body, his failed biology, said it was impossible. He was sterile. It was the one immutable truth of his life. He felt a dizzying sense of dislocation, as if the world had tilted on its axis. He looked at the celebrating sisters, at the smiling grandmother, at the proof of his lie made flesh in Mai's womb. His mind, the logical, scientific mind he had tried so hard to suppress, roared back to life, grasping for an explanation. A false pregnancy? A mistake? Or had there been someone else? The thought was a flash of hot, ugly jealousy. Had Mai, in her desperation, sought out another man? One of the village men? But that made no sense. The whole point was to bring. In new blood, he stumbled out of the longhouse, gasping for air. The village was celebrating. News had already spread like wildfire. A great cheer went up as he emerged. They were bowing to him, pressing gifts of fruit and woven cloth into his hands. He was the hero, the savior who had answered their prayers. He pushed through the adoring crowd, his mind racing. He needed to be alone. Half ran, half stumbled up a familiar path. The one Ho had taken him on, toward the clearing that overlooked the valley. He burst into the clearing, his chest heaving. He needed to think. There had to be a rational explanation. There had to be. He paced back and forth, his hands clenched in his hair. Catherine's face swam in his vision, her expression of clinical pity, the lab reports. The doctor's solemn faces. It had all been a lie. But who had lied, and why? His frantic gaze fell upon a part of the clearing he'd never noticed before, a section of the large, flat rock that was usually covered in moss and leaves. The recent rains must have washed it clean. There, carved into the stone, were drawings, or primitive stick-figure etchings, weathered by time. He knelt, his fingers tracing the faint lines. The carvings depicted a story. There was the village. There were figures of women, and there was a man. A man who was clearly an outsider. He was taller, drawn with different features. He saw the man being welcomed. He saw him with the women. He saw him holding a baby. It was his own story, etched in stone. But the story continued. He saw the man growing older. He was always with the women, always in the village. He never left. In the final carving, the man was an old, stooped figure, surrounded by children and grandchildren who did not look like the other villagers. They looked like him. A cold dread, far colder than the fear of his sterility, crept up his spine. This had happened before. He scrambled to his feet and looked around the clearing. With new eyes, he saw a small, almost hidden alcove in the rock face, choked with vines. He tore them away, his hands raw. Inside was a small, dry cave, and in the cave there was a wooden chest. His heart pounded. With trembling hands he lifted the heavy lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dried leaves, was a collection of objects. A tarnished silver compass, a rusted pocket knife, and a small leather-bound journal. He opened the journal. The ink was faded, the paper brittle. The handwriting was a spidery, elegant script. The first entry was dated May 12, 1968. The name on the inside cover read, Daniel Weston, botanist. Ethan sank to the ground, reading with a frantic, horrified intensity. Daniel Weston had been a young American scientist studying rare orchids. He'd stumbled upon Ban Skung Mu by accident after getting lost in the jungle. He wrote of their strange customs, their kindness, their isolation. He wrote of their secret sorrow. The men of the village were sterile. A lingering curse, they believed, from the yellow dust that had fallen from the sky years before. Agent Orange. A legacy of a war that had poisoned the land and the people. Then the journal's tone shifted. He wrote of a ceremony, of a request from 3 sisters. The daughters of the elder at the time. He wrote of his shock, his moral conflict. And he wrote of his decision to agree, to help them, to conduct a secret experiment of his own. Ethan's blood ran cold. He flipped through the pages, his breath catching in his throat. Daniel had fathered several children. He was a hero. But his entries grew more desperate. He wanted to leave. He missed his home, but the village wouldn't let him. He was too precious. He was their future. The path out of the valley was always blocked. He was a guest who had become a prisoner. A beloved, worshipped captive. The final entry was short, the handwriting shaky. They call me ancestor. They look at me with such love. It is the kindest prison in the world. I see the mountains, and I see only walls. My son looks at me with my own blue eyes. He will never know the sea. Ethan dropped the journal as if it were on fire. The twist was not that he was fertile. The twist was that it had never mattered. He looked at the carvings on the rock. The story of the outsider who saved the village. It wasn't a history. It was a prophecy, a blueprint. He was not the first. The sisters' request wasn't a spontaneous act of desperation. It was the enactment of a sacred tradition, a cycle of survival that had been set in motion 50 years ago. Lean, Mai, and Ho, their own father or grandfather, had been the son of this man, Daniel Weston. That was why they needed new blood again, to prevent the inevitable inbreeding. He thought of the lie Catherine had told him. Why? Had she wanted to leave him so badly she'd fabricated his sterility, knowing it was the one thing he could never argue with, a clean medical break? Or had she been protecting him from a truth she thought he couldn't handle, that she simply didn't love him anymore? The irony was crushing. He had run from a lie in Boston only to be snared by a truth in this valley that was far more terrifying. The cheering from the village below sounded different now. It wasn't a celebration of a birth. It was the sound of a cage door swinging shut. The sister's affection, Mai's loving gaze, Lean's respect. Ho's fascination, it wasn't just for him, Ethan. It was for the role he played. The outsider. The seed. The ancestor. He was a prisoner, not of malice, but of love. Of need. Of a tradition so powerful and so desperate it had become its own morality. He looked out at the magnificent, mist-filled valley, the beautiful prison. He was home. He would never leave. 9 months later, the baby was born. A boy. He had Mai's gentle eyes and Ethan's dark curly hair. The village rejoiced. They named him Essen, for the mountain. The source of their strength. Ethan held his son for the first time. The tiny, perfect weight of him, a miracle in his arms. The child was real, his son. The proof of a lie he no longer understood, a biological impossibility that was now his living, breathing reality. He looked into the infant's dark, unblinking eyes and he saw his own reflection. He was a father. He was a god. He was a sacrifice. He lived in the long house with the 3 sisters. His family, Lean, managed their lives with her quiet strength. Ho, her restless energy now channeled into doting on her nephew, still looked at him with a flicker of the old fire, a reminder of the life of sensation he had chosen. And Mai loved him. He knew her love was real, even if its roots were tangled in the desperate soil of her people's survival. He loved her too. He loved them all. His love was a complex, twisted thing, a flower grown in a cage, but it was real. He never spoke of the journal. He placed it back in the chest, back in the hidden cave, a secret for the next man 50 years from now. Sometimes he would walk to the clearing and look at the carvings, at the story of the man who came and never left. He would touch the cold stone and feel a strange kinship with Daniel Weston, the botanist who had become an ancestor. Years passed. The fog rolled in and out of the valley. Essen grew into a strong, curious boy, his laughter echoing in the longhouse. He had other children with Lean and with Ho, daughters as fierce and gentle as their mothers. His family was the heart of the village. His children, with their strange mixed blood, were the future. He no longer thought of Boston. The memories had faded, worn smooth like river stones, the pain a dull, distant ache. His life before Ban Skungmu felt like a story someone else had told him. He was Dr. Ethan Hayes no longer. He was BN Ethan. Father Ethan DOT one evening. His twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and rose. He sat on the veranda of the longhouse, his youngest daughter asleep in his lap. He watched his son, Essen, now a young man, teaching his own. The small child had a fletch and arrow. The boy had his father's eyes and his grandfather's. He looked out at the jagged peaks of the mountains, their silhouettes sharp against the dying light. They were no longer walls. They were just mountains. They were the borders of his world. They were home. He felt a profound, unsettling peace. He had been given everything a man could want: a home, a purpose, a legacy. He had saved a people. He was loved. But to have it, he had to be consumed. He had to surrender his past, his future, his very name. He looked down at the sleeping child in his arms, her small hand clutching his finger. Was he a prisoner who had learned to love his cage? Or was he a king who had finally found his kingdom? Had he made an unforgivable choice that day in the ceremonial hut? Or had he simply accepted a fate that was always waiting for him? He still didn't know, and he knew he never would. The question would be the silent, watchful companion to the rest of his days, as constant and as unknowable as the fog that drifted through the valley.